never seen you on YouTube before, so not to be a stranger.
Well, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We have quite a packed Torah portion this week. So there's lots to talk about. And I have a lot of thoughts, and so does Dennis Prager. But I wanted to start out kind of opening up, hopefully, and I'll kind of do a quick run through to refresh our memory, because I know you may have slept since you read the Torah portion, and run through some of the things that were in this portion. But I want to get some kind of like initial responses before we actually jump in and talk about this portion, because this portion has several of the passages that that people tend to use to justify some different views about God and about Israel and about different things. So, but I enjoyed actually reading through it this time, and there's several things I hope we get to. But anyway, so I kind of want some general responses before we jump in, but just in case you need a refresher, this portion has all kinds of things about what happens when children disobey their parents. It has some divorce laws. It has some laws about adultery. It has some things about slavery, loaning money, how to care for the poor, justice in the courts, kidnapping. It is quite the portion. Mm-hmm. So, if you have read the portion, hopefully, what are some initial thoughts about, or questions, I guess, just responses in general? I'll open it up that way. About what this portion, some of the things in this portion tell us about God's character, or just your responses in general to the way that some of these issues are presented.
If I may ask a dumb question, where are we starting off?
We are starting in Deuteronomy 21, verse 10,
Gotcha.
and going through chapter 25, through all of chapter 25. So 21:10 through chapter 25.
Well, starting in chapter 22 on it, it just seems like, well, in many of it, it just seems like popcorn laws that are coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're going from taking care of your neighbor's donkey that's lost to men should not cross-dress. I mean,
Right.
It's like such a weird
Yes.
jump. So a lot of these, it's almost like the whole chapter that we've got in here says love and practice,
Right.
but so much of it just seems really disconnected.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that's like one of those things where you're just like reading two sentences about this, and then it jumps over to here, and it jumps over to there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes it kind of like to try to dial down on a certain focus.
Mhm.
There's
There's
makes
so
it
much.
so much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the difficult things about this portion,
Mhm.
is that there is so much. I just started listing some of the different things, and I skipped several things, and my list still has 10 different passages on it about very different topics. So yeah, it is a little bit. I think that's a good way to describe it. It feels a little bit like kind of a popcorn jumping around situation. So why do you think that is? Why do you think we have this little bit of everything type of portion, I guess you could say?
He's covering in detail stuff that hadn't already been covered.
Mm-hmm.
I think, to me, it's almost like you're reading it like we got Moses here trying to cover as much ground as he possibly can before he goes up the mountain and dies.
Yeah, I think so.
So it's almost like when you're sending your kid out, or you've got a grocery list or something, it's like, oh wait, one more thing, oh wait, one more thing.
Yes.
That's kind of has this, you're getting ready, oh wait, one more thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I feel like this chapter kind of covers, or this entire book at the end.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of instructions. Oh yeah, and here's this little detail about this, and here's this little detail about that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think he's just trying, in my opinion, he's just trying to get as much in as possible before he goes up the mountain. I almost feel, when I read the book of Deuteronomy, a type of anxiety on Moses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To get everything he possibly can relayed to these people, to give them the best chance to do what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
You know, like a parent sending their kid off to college and
Yes.
having that sit down.
I'm just gonna make the exact same
Yeah,
analogy.
yeah. I've often thought the same thing. Is it very much feels like, all right, I got, we got to get the last few things in before we leave.
Yeah.
Before they send him off, or before he's not
Yeah.
with them anymore. So yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. Anybody else have general responses or ideas about what this portion tells us about the character of God before we actually start jumping in and looking at a few specific passages? We won't make it to everything. There's too much.
While it may seem like it bounced around quite a bit, God is a God of order.
Mhm.
So anything that he would have relayed to Moses would have been in the order that he would have wanted things to go.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses is obedient, so he follows
Mm-hmm.
God's direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
I also wonder if that wasn't a part of Moses' personality himself, was that to lay those things out
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
for his people, and that God knew that.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I think another thing that was coming to mind is I was kind of processing with the Lord a little bit about is thinking of this mountain structure that we have, or this chiastic structure we have in the Torah, where Genesis and Deuteronomy parallel on the bottom level, and then the kind of mid-level is Exodus and Numbers, and then we have, of course, the beautiful Leviticus as the top of the mountain. And I will say it just as a random side note, as I was reading through Dennis Prager's commentary, he points back to many of the things in this point back to instruction that was given in Leviticus. And so he'll mention that in his commentary, and then I'm like, then give me the Leviticus commentary. I have a feeling, this is just like my gut sense, but I have a feeling that Leviticus is going to be the last book that he releases in the Torah commentary. And I don't know that that's true. I need to do some more searching and see if he's announced anything for the next volume, because it's been almost a year since Deuteronomy was released, to see if they're going to start announcing the next one. But I have a feeling it will be Numbers and then Leviticus will be last, which means I probably have about 3 more years until I get Leviticus. And I'm like, come on! Anyway, good morning, Elijah.
Good morning.
Also, there's pastries back there. We had extra pastries at the bakery yesterday, so
Okay.
and help yourself if you would like pastry.
Thank you.
So anyway, that's my random side note about that. But it does connect back. But where I was going before I distracted myself about Leviticus is, so if we think of this idea that Deuteronomy is kind of at this base, it does take us back a little bit to, and this is where I want us to go. I'm hoping we can get to. Looking at some of the character of God, is like there's some foundational things in here about how you live if you're honoring God. Like they've already received kind of the details of the sacrificial system, the details of the tabernacle, the details of this is how you worship God, and a lot of this has to do with like how you relate to other people, right? Like this has to do with community life and some legal situations. I did think as I was reading through too, I was like, man, this is a good Kenny portion. There's lots of legal things. So I can't say that I will do as good a job as Kenny would at discussing some of the legal things, but my lens is a little bit more on what does this reveal about the character of God. Not that Kenny doesn't also talk about that, but there's different ways. That's one of the fun things about having different people who teach Torah and looking at it through different people's lens, right? Is that there's something different highlighted to each of us, which is one of the things I love about studying Torah together, especially. So let's start jumping into a couple of these. And before we jump into some of these more, well, this one fits this category too, but this one has a specific New Testament application. So I want to start with Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23. So this is this portion about someone who's hung on a tree. Right? And so immediately I hope that your brain jumps to Yeshua. So these couples verses catch me up every year because it's so interesting to me. And I think we could spend a lot of time here. We won't spend a ton of time here, but we could. But it says, suppose a man is guilty of a sin with a death sentence and he is put to death and you hang him on a tree. His body is not to remain all night on the tree. Instead, you must certainly bury him the same day, for anyone hanged is a curse of God. You must not defile your land that Adonai your God is giving you as an inheritance. So, if we think to Yeshua, right, we know that, so this hung on a tree is probably not literally like a tree that's growing outside, right? It's like, it's a pole of wood. and some, Dennis Prager kind of brings out that it even could possibly mean like being impaled on a stake. So there's some different ways to look at this. No matter how you look at it, it's a really unpleasant way to die. And it's really gruesome. And then there's also this aspect of this ancient practice of putting a criminal on display, right? But what's the thing about Yeshua that makes that brings even more attention to it? He wasn't a criminal, right? He's the only man who's lived without sin. And yet what strikes me every year when I read these verses is that he died this public criminal's death for what? Why?
Because he's a curse, but it's our curse. He took on
right.
our curse.
Right. It's this self-sacrifice, and it's this atonement, and it's so many things. But I think thinking about Yeshua's death in the context of this sentence, I don't know, it does something in me. It's like, oh, this is like a big deal. And even there's Torah about it. And Dennis Prager kind of brings out the point of the Israelites shouldn't really be participating in this practice. This is a pagan thing. And again, even especially going to the whole putting a criminal on display, and they would leave them up there for days and just let, and you can imagine a body out, exposed to the elements, exposed to to scavenging creatures, it's disgusting. And so, but the Torah is, because the Torah has this, hopefully we're starting to see as we approach, as we've gotten this far, and hopefully some of us have read it several years in a row, we're seeing that the Torah has this specific, definitive focus on the dignity of people. And so what he's saying here, because of this instruction that you cannot leave the body there overnight, which we of course know is also observed with Yeshua, that they don't leave him. And again, because crucifixion specifically, that version of being hung on a tree, is often a slower death, it would sometimes take people more than a day to die. Yeshua, it seems, died actually pretty quickly. And that's why they would break their legs, so that they couldn't, overnight somehow get away or something like that.
Or they would push up.
Yes.
To try to get air. So if they broke their legs, they can't raise their body up to get the air anymore either. So that...
Yeah, because crucifixion, you effectively die by suffocating. So So yeah, but we know that this was carried out, right? We know that they came and took his body off and buried him and laid him in a tomb that same day.
And it also happened that it was almost Shabbat.
It was almost Shabbat, right?
So they had to
Yes.
hurry up and
Yes.
get him
Yes.
off the cross.
So, and I think it's interesting that at the end of this, it's that you do not defile the land.
Mhm.
Like, there's certain types of death and there's certain things that defile the land itself, and apparently this type of death and leaving that person there is one of those things. So it's just, I don't know, it's just really interesting. If anybody else has any other comments, we can talk about it a little bit more before we move on. I just couldn't skip over that one because it does have such a connection with Yeshua, of this man who knew no sin, to take on this ultimate sinner's death. Of course, by the time we get to Yeshua, there's the Roman piece, and it's not exactly necessarily this exact situation, but it's just interesting that we have this connection back to the Torah even in it.
I guess you could take it as a question, but with this man in particular that was hung on the tree and ordered to be buried the following, not to be left overnight on the tree, otherwise the land would be cursed. But it doesn't say to take the body outside of the land to bury it, it's just bury the body.
Mm-hmm.
And that would eliminate the curse that would have been brought upon them.
Mm-hmm.
How does, I'm trying to understand how, if they would have left them, they would have been cursed, but by burying the body on that land, I don't know whereabouts, but.
Yeah. It has to do with the dignity of the person. It has to do, again, with this public display of a dead body versus burying it or putting it in a tomb is hidden away, and is that's more respectful to that person's body, to not be, again, on display, exposed to whatever, basically where you get in, or in the situation of watching this body either be scavenged or just decay from the elements, that it's far more dignifying for that person to be buried. And so the curse comes from that. It's again going back to the honor of the person, even though it's a criminal, overly exposing that. Because a lot of what, and this is kind of an overarching theme of a lot of the things that we see in this portion, is that a lot of the instruction that's given about how people, particularly criminals, or particularly people who are typically understood as, for lack of a better term, less than in society, women, children, slaves, the poor, the needy, those kinds of things, the way that the Torah instructs dealing with people, with those categories of people, is significantly more dignified than the ancient world. And this is one of the things I appreciate most about Dennis Prager, is he brings out this contrast between how Israel was instructed to live to be understood as a contrast to the rest of the ancient world. Now, in our modern world, it's difficult for us to see that because we don't study other ancient cultures. I haven't done a lot of study on it myself, but we lose some of that apparent contrast that would have been really clear to the people who were initially receiving these instructions, because they knew how the rest of the world lived and they knew what was normal in that time. It was very normal to put somebody on display and make an example of them. It's like, you commit this crime, this is what happens to you. And to use those fear tactics, or to use oppression to force obedience or something like that. And the way that the Torah, which is why I want to talk about a few of these specific things, because our modern brains have a hard time seeing some of this. But the way that the Torah is instructing them to live is actually really, Dennis Prager tends to use the word progressive. I hesitate to use that because of its connotations in our society right now, but for its time, it's much more progressive and much more dignified than any other nation in the ancient world. So, again, going back to at the very beginning, I mentioned that this portion has several passages that people use to show how barbaric sometimes the Torah is, when actually the opposite is true. And that's why it's important for us to understand a little bit about some of the ancient context of what's going on here.
So, just to make a comment again about not defiling the land.
Mm-hmm.
So much of Deuteronomy is about when you go into this land.
Yes.
And with tying this to Yeshua's crucifixion, and we see that the land itself shook. I mean, we had
Mhm.
the earthquake,
Yeah.
it's like the land also responded. It was, yes, we got the curse broken off of us.
Yeah.
But the land responded
Right.
to a breaking of the curse also, because the land obviously had been defiled
Yes.
again.
Mhm.
So we see, like in that just 3 sentences there,
Mhm.
the restoration of man, but earth responding
Yeah.
Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
also.
That's really good. Yeah, I think that's like really good, a really good point, a really good connection of like that a lot of this is about the land, because again, there's this emphasis that yes, Israel is the land that the Israelites are inheriting, but the land belongs to the Lord. Like the land belongs to God, which is why we have so many passages of, if you do this and you're faithful and obedient, you will stay in the land. And if not, the land will spit you out.
Yeah.
You know, and there's actually a lot of things in between there, where really the Lord's heart is mercy to try to get them to turn back before that happens. And of course, we know that doesn't always happen. But yeah.
Well, I'm curious. I'm wondering if it is not that if what you're saying is right, but in a different context, that the land had been defiled for years. Ever since the garden, but then the Watchers come down on Mount Hermon and defile the bloodline, and then you got the everything from the Nephilim and the Canaanites, and you have all these different defilements in the land going on, and it was His blood that
Yep.
purified and broke
Right.
that curse,
Mhm.
and just like He did with our blood
Mhm.
and purified it, He purified the land and broke that curse off the land
Yeah.
as well.
And even specifically the place where Yeshua was crucified. I mean, how many other men were crucified on Golgotha before he was? And
Hundreds of
defiled
times.
the land.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then his death cleanses it.
Mhm.
It cleanses the land as much as it cleanses us
Mhm.
Right.
through
Yeah.
his blood.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would the earthquake have even happened?
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
so what you just said, it reminds me that Golgotha was known as a place of cursing.
Mhm. Yeah.
And real quick before we move on, I'd never thought of this before, this correlation, that I wonder if this also wasn't a last-ditch effort by the enemy. Like, okay, like in reality, maybe the enemy knows that's the Son of God. And so the temptation in the wilderness doesn't work. The trying to trick him with the different, what about this? And no, that didn't work. Darn it. Finally, last-ditch effort. We will not only kill him, but we'll hang him on a tree to kill him, so he'll be a curse to God. Aha! We finally figured it out.
Right.
And then, oh no, that didn't work either.
Yeah.
But it just seems like a last-ditch effort to make him a curse under God.
Yeah.
You
No,
know.
I agree. I think because of course we know like the kingdom of darkness is this counterfeit kingdom. And so yeah, there's this interesting, I mean, really the enemy is not really so brilliant. He does kind of use some of these tactics that it's like once you figure it out, it's like he kind of uses the same tactics over and over again. So yeah, it's interesting to be like, oh, I can kill the Son of God, which this interesting. I think I've mentioned it before, and it's kind of one of these weird things because I took a whole class about anti-Semitism because there's this interesting study of like why are the Jewish people why have they had such a target on their back through all of history, and really there's some thoughts that it's because they're the people, of course, that God has chosen to put his name on. So it's like, if you can't kill God himself, you can kill his people. And so it's this interesting, so again, extending that to Yeshua and the Messiah, it's like, you know, it's this scheme of the enemy to make Yeshua just a man. And so and to put him on display, to disgrace him, and and all of these things, right? Which just doesn't work. I mean, that's one of the things they say about, like, even in Jerusalem, like, because we know that Yeshua that he ascended on the Mount of Olives, and that he will return there. But between the Mount of Olives and the temple is a graveyard. And the story I've always heard is part of the reason that is because if Yeshua returns, he won't be able to pass over the dead bodies because it will make him unclean. I'm like, I'm pretty sure he can find a way around that.
Yeah.
You know, and they've sealed up the eastern gate, and it's like I'm pretty sure that when mountains are splitting, you know, north and south and east, I'm pretty sure it's gonna work out okay. It's just interesting, you know, all these all these things that, you know, the enemy tries to use to keep God from being God, which is interesting, and that's an interesting discussion. So.
Proceed to clear your
Sorry.
Okay, so I want to talk about a few of these. Again, we won't get to everything in this portion, but I want to talk about a few of these situations that are covered in this portion, and see if we can find something about God's character in it. So we'll start out in chapter 21, just before the passage that we were just talking about. Let's talk about this stubborn and rebellious son. So chapter 21, verse 18. Suppose a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not listen to the voice of his father or mother. They discipline him, but he does not listen to them. Then his father and mother are to grab hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city, to the gate of his place. They will say to the elders of his city, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He does not listen to our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Then all the men of his city are to stone him with stones to death. So you will purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear and be afraid. Okay, so has anybody ever read this passage and been like a bit horrified that there's instruction about how to kill a child who dishonors his parents?
I would have been dead a long time ago.
So, first of all, I'll point out, we don't actually have any record of this ever happening, of this ever being carried out, as far as I know. So that being said, why does God give this instruction? Why does God instruct on how to deal with this situation in this way, if it seems like it's actually never going to happen?
To put the fear of him into the young adults, children,
Mm-hmm.
wayward children, knowing that this is what they could face if they continue going down this path of disobedience, dishonoring their
Mhm.
mother and father.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
Well, it's a warning to the parents also, raise your kid right,
Okay.
or you take the chance of losing it.
Mm-hmm.
Although just in rereading this, the young man, he wasn't a child, obviously. If he was a drunkard or a glutton and a drunkard, wouldn't be a young child. He would have been I don't know of what age he would have been.
Okay. Who kills the child?
All the men.
All the men. All the men of the city. Do you think that, well, let me read this. So I found this super fascinating. So I'm going to read you a paragraph out of Dennis Prager's commentary about this. And I will say, I'm trusting that he's done his research, which I believe that Dennis Prager has, but he doesn't tend to cite all of where he gets all of this ancient perspective. And so the Bible's the the student in me, the theology student in me, is a little bit like, cite your sources, dude. But anyway, but from what I've read, I do think this is reasonable. But I think this was a really interesting perspective that I hadn't thought of all of these things before, so I kind of wanted to share this. So he says, this law concerning the rebellious son seems primitive, but it was profoundly progressive in its time. It forbade parents from ever killing their children, as was the parental prerogative in much of the ancient world and remains so in parts of the world today. This law removed the right to execute a child from parents, while enabling parents to believe they still had traditional authority over their child and preserving the message to the child that he is accountable. No longer could parents kill their child, rather they had to bring their antisocial son before the court of elders to be publicly judged and, if found guilty, executed. And then he says, as there's no evidence of such measures actually having been taken in the Old Testament, and we do not know of a case of judicial execution of a child in Jewish history, the law effectively outlawed killing children 3,000 years ago. So notice in there it talks about the common practice in the ancient world is that if children, and again, it does seem that this is pointing to not just like, parent told their kid to clean their room and kid was defiant and said no. Like, this is a bigger deal. Like, this is like, again, because it uses the phrase to purge evil from your midst, we're talking about a heart of evil. We're not talking about just immature disobedience. We're talking about evil. We're talking about true rebellion and being against the Lord ultimately. So what Dennis Prager is suggesting is that in the ancient world, if you have a child who is, completely disobedient or disregarding the norms of society, that parent can kill the child. And that's not difficult to believe, right? We know all kinds of things about child sacrifice. Later on, I don't know if we'll get to it, and I don't remember exactly what the example is. Oh, later in the portion, there's a verse that says something about like that children cannot be put to death for the sins of their fathers, because that was also a common practice. Was if you have a dispute with someone and they do something that you go and take their child. Like, these are, like, this is like barbaric to us, but this is common practice in the ancient world. So again, what I'm trying to point out is that the Torah is actually elevating how they do this. And by not allowing parents to kill this, they have to go through a judicial system. There has to be a judgment by the elders of the city. And then all of the elders and all the men of the city have to agree to carry this out, which is extremely unlikely. Right? Yeah. Which is why he's making the point that the Torah is actually outlawing killing children in a time when that was very common. So again, like, I just say this to, like, this is why it's like important for us to think about, like, who do we know God to be? And when we read passages like this, that to our in our modern context, we're like, this is terrible. They're giving instruction about how you kill a child. Like, that actually this was bringing more. This was calling to a higher level of righteousness. I'll say it that way. Okay, let's move on and see some of these other examples. So Genesis. We're in Deuteronomy, not Genesis. Hi guys. 22. I'm going to skip over a little bit. A lot of this has to do with. There's several things in there. Again, this is like one of those, like, there's kind of a little bit of everything, but it talks about, not planting different kinds of seeds in the same field. It talks about clothing. It talks about whatever. And some of that, we don't necessarily know a whole lot of reason behind it, other than this. The commentators suggest that the point is being made of not having this mixture, extending to this idea of not having mixture in worship, extending to this whole, like, you don't bring in pagan practices among worship to the Lord and things like that. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there because there's a couple other things I want to touch on. And then the second half of that chapter gets into some of these things about adultery and really some sexual immorality. And I'm not going to go there because we had quite a discussion this is a passage that would apply again to John 8, which again, I will just make the statement that John 8 is actually not about adultery, even though the example used to make the point is a woman, the so-called woman caught in adultery. But we pointed out the issues of that, and we made the point last week and had a long discussion on how that situation does not demonstrate how the Torah is saying that things are supposed to be carried out, and that's why Yeshua's response is so significant. So we're gonna not revisit that. So let's go to just briefly chapter 23, which I can't remember now. I need to look. I think chapter 23 is the chapter. Yeah, it is. So the chapter 23 is one of those interesting places where we have verse numbering is off a bit. So if you're using the TLV or a Jewish translation, the Jewish numbering is slightly off from the Christian translations. So depending on what translation you're using, your verses may be one off from what I'm reading. But in the TLV, chapter 23, verse 8, you are not to detest an Edomite, for he is your brother. You are not to detest an Egyptian, for you were an outsider in his land. The children born to them, the third generation, may enter the community of Adonai. Okay, so why are the Edomites called out here?
Children of Esau.
The children of Esau. Okay, which is why he's saying he's your brother, right? These are the descendants of Esau. And then the Egyptian is really interesting, right? It's really interesting that God is basically saying you cannot detest the Egyptian, even though they're the ones that enslaved them for 400 years. Like, that's an interesting thing, right? So why, and the Edomites, we have some different situations with the Edomites in the Torah. There's some different encounters. They're not all necessarily completely negative, but they're not really buddies at this point. So what is the Lord saying about this? About why is he instructing them not to hate these people who are, in the case of the Egyptians, probably seen as at least as an oppressor, if not just an outright enemy, and then the Edomites, who are probably listed more among the list of enemies than friends. Why is he saying that you can't hate them or detest them?
Their call is to the nations.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've already written off a people group, if they've already written off a people group, then they are like reducing their call to the nations. They don't get to make the choices on that.
Yeah.
The Lord, and they might have valid reasons for grudges, but the Lord's heart is still towards those nations also.
Right.
So this is part of this calling thing. And so he's warning them, you're not allowed to detest those who I don't detest.
Right.
I wonder if also too, if it has to do with that because of our sin, in a sense, we are all considered foreigners to God's kingdom. So he's saying, even the Egyptians, you were outsiders in their land. They might seem like outsiders to God's kingdom, but don't detest them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because even they can be welcome to them. I mean, it's almost as if the Lord's saying, remember my mercy.
Yes.
Remember my mercy towards you and towards them.
Mm-hmm.
He's also letting them know that they're eventually entering the community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, saying, third generation gets to enter in.
Right.
So if you detest these people, how are they going to enter into the community?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that also that Egypt originally, like,
Yeah, so I think with both the Edomites, that's important, because I think with both the Edomites and the Egyptians, we see what you're saying is we see actually some good relationships starting out. Like, I think God's heart with the Edomites, with the descendants of Esau, they weren't really ever supposed to be excluded from the family. Like, yes, the blessing and the people of Israel would come through the line of Jacob. That doesn't mean that Esau was supposed to be included. And so in the modern age, this is where we see, like, this is one of the things that we pray for, or should be praying for as we pray for the salvation of Israel, is also for the reconciliation between Jew and Arab, which is maybe an overgeneralization, but like, this is, like, that's why it's such a big deal, as even, Arab Christians, not all, I'm making a blanket statement, but I am acknowledging that this is not true in all cases, but many Arab Christians do not have favorable views of Jewish people, even Jewish believers in Yeshua. So as we're praying for...
And vice versa.
Right, yeah. There's a lot of tension between these groups of people. And so this is one of the things that we need to be praying for, is we pray for the land of Israel, and we pray for the body of Messiah, and we pray for the salvation of Israel, is that this relationship between Jew and Arab would be healed. Because they are, and Asher talks a lot about this, and this is why the relationship between Asher and Trader and David Damien is so significant, is because it really is, it's this partnership and this covenant relationship between Jew and Arab, which is not common, but is difficult, and part of the reason that they get so much criticism. Anyway, so that's the Edomite side of it. And then the Egyptian side of it is, yes, without going to Egypt, the Israelites would have, right? Jacob's family would not have survived had Joseph not gone and had this favorable position in Egypt. And so really, Egypt saved their lives. And Egypt has an interesting role throughout, throughout the rest of the Tanakh even, is like there's a few passages about Egypt. And yes, there's a lot, there's judgment, but there's also this, like, you can't hate it's this repeated thing of, you can't hate the Egyptian because they're supposed to be part of God's family. And really on a greater level is what this points us to, is exactly what Lori said too, is that the calling of Israel is to be a light to the nations. All of the nations. Like, all nations are to come and worship before the Lord, right? And so, yeah, even though there's a lot of tension, and even though like in the modern age there's a lot of tension, there's still this desire that all nations would be welcome to come and worship the Lord.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting...
And there's even prophetic declaration for Egypt of what,
right,
as a nation, Egypt will be in the day of the Lord, the day of Yeshua's return. Yeah. They will be the guiding light, the driving, Isaiah 19, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Egypt even operated as a safe haven for Yeshua when when Herod was killing all the infants. Exactly. Mary and Joseph took him down to Egypt to hang out for a while before coming back up. And had a couple hundred years earlier they had started this animosity and this declaration not been in here, then who knows, maybe they would have been at war at that point. Yeah. So all part of God's plan.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And that's even part of Yeshua going to Egypt as a child, is even this part of, like, we see that Yeshua relives Israel's story in his own life, which is really interesting, and that's something really fun to explore as well. Okay, I want to move on a little bit. We have like 15 minutes left. Excuse me. So, the next little section, if we can get through it, I want to try to hit two more things at least before we end. So this next section is in Deuteronomy 23, 16 and 17. You are not to hand over to his master a slave who seeks refuge with you from his master. Let him dwell with you in your midst, in the place he chooses within one of your town gates, the one that is good for him, you are not to mistreat him. So, and I think there's maybe something else. I thought there was another section about slavery somewhere in this portion. Maybe not. Maybe it's just another section. But this goes back to this, and we've talked about this before, and Tom has taught on this before as well, is that when we read about slavery in the Torah, it's really important that we remember that we're not talking about like the African slave trade that took place in the U.S. This is a very different type of slavery. And actually, there is if we connect in, this is what I wanted to do. This is where I was going. Thank you, Lord. If we jump over to chapter 24, verse 7, if a man is caught kidnapping any of his brothers from Bnei Israel, whether he treats him like property or sells him, then that kidnapper must die, so you are to purge evil from your midst. Mm-hmm. So, again, going back to thinking about how did we get the slaves that were a part of the African slave trade in the U.S.? Kidnapping. So, and Dennis Prager makes this connection too. Like, what's one of the 10 Commandments? You cannot steal, meaning you cannot steal people. Yeah. Right?
Anything.
Right. And so this is, so again, I'm just making the point because it's hard for, like, our brains, we hear the word slavery, we automatically think slave trade in the U.S., which is a natural connection. I'm just saying Torah outlaws that. Torah would not allow that situation. Torah is very clear about that. The slavery that they're talking about is an entirely different type of situation. And even there's other passages in the Torah that talks about how they're to be treated, and even to the extent that, and even, the instructions on the Jubilee, they're supposed to go free, and different, some of these different things about how slaves are treated and their length of service and all these things. But it even gives instruction that if the slave wants to stay, which must mean that this is not a bad situation. They love their master, they're treated well. Often this is like indentured service. These are people who are paying off a debt or something like that by working. But they are to be treated well because, again, what is the point of the Torah? Is that we treat humans with dignity. We treat all humans as image bearers, right? And so that's why, again, the Torah points out how we treat these people who are often seen in societies as, quote unquote, less than. That the Torah is like, you can't do that. You can't treat people as objects. You can't treat them as property. You can't treat them. There's a minimum standard that you must maintain, and that's what is playing into a lot of this. So, and it does talk about that. Really. So really in this situation, the assumption is probably that if a slave is trying to escape, then there's some mistreatment happening, which is, why there's this instruction that if somebody is seeking refuge, you have to let them stay. And they get to stay anywhere they want. If whatever part of the land they're in, wherever you have to give them land. They get to have part of that. They get to be there. So, and you're not to mistreat them, meaning you're not allowed to just take them and be like, well, now you're my slave. You ran away, so now you're going to be like, I'm going to enslave. Like, you don't get to do that. So, again, it's another one of these examples of the Torah kind of elevating how you deal with people. Any other comments on that?
Well, it also kind of shows that just because one person in your community isn't functioning or doing what they should be doing, the community still has a responsibility for that. So, the community has a responsibility to deal with a bad kid. The community has a responsibility to deal with a situation where somebody's abusing their servant. The community has to step up and do the right thing when someone in the community is doing something wrong.
Right.
It isn't a individual justice, it's a
Right.
community justice.
Right.
It's a collective.
Yeah. And again, one of the other thing it points out, we probably won't get to really lay in there, but one of the things that, similar to the example of the child being brought before the elders and having to kind of go through this judicial system. Similarly, in chapter 24 with the passages about divorce and the process that's allowed. So in the ancient world, just real briefly, I wasn't going to spend a lot of time here, but it connects in a little bit with what we're saying. Most ancient cultures, you didn't, if a husband decided to divorce his wife, you didn't really have to divorce him, you just send him away. Which then what happens, what's the fate of that woman most likely? Probably death, eventually. Prostitution, slavery, death. Those are
survival mode.
Yeah, those are probably the options in all practicality.
Yeah, in a culture, in a world where women weren't valued
Right.
at all.
Right. So it's interesting, and again, this is another one of these passages that sometimes people will use in a twist to show that God is not just, and be like, well, the woman doesn't have the right to divorce a man, or why does only the man get to? And it's like he still gets to just decide if he wants to divorce her. But the difference here is that he's required to go through a process, and he's required to give her a written document of divorce, and so it's this she's being released, and sometimes, and there's some different ideas, and I don't know that we fully know all of this, is because of course in the ancient world, marriage is also somewhat of a business transaction, right? Like the husband has paid the bride price for this wife, and so there's some even understanding that he would maybe give that back or release her with something of that. But at the very least, she's released with dignity to either go back to her father's home and to be with the opportunity then to be married again, or and just things like that. So it does actually preserve her dignity more than just being and it also prevents him from doing it in just like a heated moment of like, I'm mad at you, get out of here. Like you can't do that. You have to go through the right channels to get this bill of divorce and let this happen. So it prevents this, heated moment of
Rashness.
Yeah, this rash decision.
That's where alimony comes in too,
Mhm.
because it's going to cost you. I mean, it better be legitimate. Like when the concept of alimony or supporting that, you're going to have to. You made a vow to this person, with this woman. You promised to take care of
Right.
her in a sense, and you will take care of her one way or another.
Right.
And so
Right.
the Lord's still holding them to a portion of that vow, of that commitment, of what He's supposed to be making
Right.
sure that this woman doesn't have to sell herself into prostitution or go out there and die. So the guy's got to really, like, in all of these things we're seeing, weigh the consequences
Right.
of your action.
Right. And again, it goes back to, and part of that, I think a big part of that in a lot of these instances is the slowing of the process.
Mhm.
Whereas in the ancient world, it's like, yeah, you have this moment of passion, or you're just kind of carried away by your emotions, and you're individually making a decision about something is going to be destructive in some of these situations, right? Whereas what we're seeing here, right, is what Lori was mentioning, is there's this community aspect. There's this aspect of the elders by the gate, this judgment panel, basically, this group of people who's been set in to make decisions and to judge these elements that slows the process, right? You have to go before these people, and they have to investigate, and they have to agree that what you're accusing has actually happened, and agree to carry out whatever judgment and justice has been deemed appropriate. And so I think it like that's reasonable, right? Like that, that's why that's why community is so important, and that's why having people around you and having people who have this standard of living to keep you accountable is that you can't make some of these destructive decisions, because slowing the process does often lead to a more rational outcome. right? Do you have something, Elaine?
Why can't she go back to her first husband? Why does that make her defiled? Why can't the first husband take her back if her other husband's dead? Excuse me.
It's because,
Because if it's going off the standard, well, she's been with another man, well, she's been with another man for the second
Yeah.
husband, so.
yeah, so I think the way that it's worded, let me see if I can-
Cause it's not like you're choosing to leave the second husband to go back to the first, he's dead.
Well, it gives both situations. It gives both the second husband decides to divorce or the second husband has died. So it's basically, I think it's basically this I don't know. We don't have a lot of information about the reasoning behind this. But some of what I've read has to do with the fact that if the first husband has already decided to divorce her, like it really is kind of to keep her from being played as a pawn in some of this. Is that like if he's already divorced her, something happens to second husband, whether it's divorce or he dies. Going back to the first husband, I don't know that there's a lot of confidence that's really going to be better. I think there's an element of keeping her from being caught in a cycle. So
Do you feel like maybe it's set up that way because there's a finality? Like if
Yeah.
you divorce, this is it. There's
Yeah.
a finality. So to go back to that, that's supposed to be a closed door, is what if this is completely irreconcilable and you've divorced, then this is a closed door.
mhm.
And maybe that's what the Lord's like trying to keep them from being able to be flaky on that. It's like, I
Yeah.
could be wrong because it doesn't give you specifics on that other than to say, don't do it. So,
Right.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, but I think there's a few pieces at play. I think what you're saying is true, that there is this finality to it, that it's like if you chose to divorce her, you kind of don't really get another chance. Like, it's kind of a done deal. Now, as far as what would happen, hopefully, and again, we're just given a few sentences here, so we don't know a lot about the situation. And again, Torah is more descriptive than prescriptive in most cases. Like it gives us, like, this is why it's important that we're understanding the character and the heart of God more so than necessarily looking for the Torah to tell us exactly how to deal with every specific situation, because it can't. And I know everybody understands that. And so we don't have a lot of detail about this situation here. And so so this would be something where, again, it's like, this is why you have this kind of, a council of elders or a council of leaders to help make decisions in certain things, is because Torah can't give an exact, this is how you carry out this exact thing. So in this situation, I think, hopefully this woman has children. Hopefully she has sons, honestly, to help ensure her livelihood eventually and be taken care of, because that's just how society worked at the time. But I think also, I think it's partially, I think there is maybe a level of protection that if you have this first husband who's divorced you, because it doesn't sound like, this is all very business-like in how this is laid out. This is not like, oh, she was so in love with him and she wants to go back. This is like, how is this gonna play? I don't know, but it's all speculation. It's a little bit of speculation, but I think that there's some level of protection, and there's also some level of, like, you have to understand the finality of what you're doing. So.
Can I say something? With all due respect to the women here today, looks like to me that through the whole regulation that written there, women are second class. And if I was to be objective, and I would be a woman at that time or today, I wouldn't allow no regulation imposed on me like that. All what the men decide and all what the men agree or determine, the woman has to go through. She doesn't have no say. So it's a little bit of the touching the integrity of the woman, of the person.
So yes, so this isn't a patriarchal society where, for the most part, women are seen as less than. And that's much of the point I'm trying to make, is that this is actually far more just than any other society. If I lived in this time period when this was written, I would want to be a woman in Israel versus any other country and in any other nation, because I'm going to be treated far better. And actually, the woman cannot be forced to marry anyone. She does have a choice. So there is, so while, yes, women are not seen as, and again, Torah is, this is one of the arguments that Dennis Prager makes too, is like, Torah, this is why he calls his commentary the rational Bible, is it's like, this is laying out instruction with the practical reality of the world that it's taking place in. So whether we, especially in our modern age, agree with it or not, this was the reality of the time, which is why God is being, in some sense, practical, in the sense of like, you know, in an ancient culture, you can only have so much shift at any given time. But we see the trajectory through, if we continue on through the rest of the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, we see that continue to move in the right direction. We see women ministering alongside Paul and the rest of the apostles. We see a continued trajectory in a great honoring direction for women throughout the Bible. So what I'm trying to point out in these situations is, yes, the woman, which again is why I'm making the point that it's important that we understand that part of what the Torah is doing is showing that the God of Israel is far more just and far more dignified than any other God of any other nation. And he's instructing them that you cannot treat women in certain ways that other even to the point, as we skipped over some of it, when they go out to the war, when the men conquer another nation, they are not allowed to rape the women of the nation they are conquering. And that's common. I mean, that's still common practice.
But they're allowed to kill them.
Sometimes. But that's a different rule. And that, again, all of the times when that's instructed, it's because of purging the evil in their midst. So it's not God just saying, it's because there's evil. And it's because Israel cannot, they can't welcome evil, and you can't welcome people. But again, that's why I think it was in last week's portion, they do also have the prescription of, if you go and you conquer a nation and you want to take this woman as your wife, this is what you must do. You must bring her in, you shave her head, you allow her to warn her family, you allow all of these things before they can take her as wife, meaning they can't just go in and rape her because they want to. Other nations do not work like that. So again, I'm not saying,
if she's single and not been with a man, okay, but the rest of them has to be killed. Even there are little boys, 2-year-old or baby, and men and women who has been married or has known a man before, they all will be eliminated. So now you're telling me that it is all right for the Torah to have those women who happen to be free from all these conditions, that they can be captured, unraped, and being treated like a human being. But the rest of them is to be determined. That's a problem.
it is difficult to understand, but again, it's about the Lord is saying we can't have mixture, we can't have worship of other gods. So there has to be a process through which if somebody's going to survive from these pagan nations that God is judging as evil, and He knows their hearts, we don't get to make that judgment. That if they're going to be And there's always an allowance for those who yield, whose hearts want to turn. But there has to be a process for that. So that's a different discussion than the one that we're having about this portion.
Mhm.
So going back to, and we need to wrap up because we're over time a little bit, but going back to this is I'm not saying that this is an ideal way for us to necessarily carry out our lives. What I'm saying is what this reveals about the heart and character of God is that human dignity is important. And what he's showing in how he's instructing them to deal with slaves, to deal with women, to deal with the poor, to deal with the outsider in their midst, to deal with all of these different people, the common denominator is you must not treat them as other nations treat them. You must treat them better. They must have a way for their lives to improve. They must have a way for their condition to improve. They must have a way to come before the Lord and worship him. So, ancient cultures weren't concerned with any of that. And so, the point that I'm trying to make and what I'm trying to show here is that that Israel is supposed to carry the heart of God in that way. And again, this goes back to Israel being the light, calling to be the light to the nations. Because if other nations are watching how Israel carries themselves, and if they're living in the way that he has instructed, and the other nations are seeing how they're treating women, how they're treating slaves, how they're treating the runaway slave, potentially from another nation that has somehow found its way into the midst of Israel, which would be somewhat miraculous, honestly. That is supposed to say something. That is supposed to demonstrate something to other nations. We know that Israel has not always carried this out perfectly, because we know that humans are not God. And yet, he has chosen to write his story through this people. There are things that we will always wrestle with. There are things that always won't make sense to us. But that's what I'm trying to, the theme that I'm trying to draw out is his character and the trajectory that he's setting for the people of Israel. He doesn't want them to stay here, is my point, right? So he doesn't necessarily, this is not always the best way to say it because you can go too many ways with it, but in some level these are minimum expectations. He actually expects Israel to be continually improving and to continually being better at honoring the dignity of the individual and of the collective. So this is again, we're starting with progressive revelation. So where we started in Genesis, we've already, if you compare back to where we started in Genesis to where we are now in Deuteronomy, we've already seen a really big shift in how, well, one, we didn't have the nation of Israel when we started the Torah, but we've seen a really big shift in even in the family of Israel, even in the fact, Jacob had all these wives and it didn't really go very well for him. So God's like, maybe don't do that. Except in instances where the reason that it doesn't completely outlaw polygamy in this is, again, to care for the woman. Like, the reason there's this instruction about, for example, in this portion, the situation where the husband dies and the brother takes the wife, that's to care for her. That's so that she, again, doesn't end up dead in prostitution or in slavery. So again, we're saying that's not an ideal. That's not what God wants for her. That's not what God wants for that family, because it's going to be complicated. Any family where there's more than one wife has challenges that God doesn't actually want. But again, he makes allowances for certain things. And again, this is an ancient society where every nation is doing this. So he's saying, if this is going to be the situation, this is how it has to be done. And it's actually to preserve life versus just being greedy or having what you want or making women a possession or something like that. So I'm not saying these are not difficult things, and I'm not saying that they necessarily shouldn't even kind of give us some tension of like, I don't, this isn't really how I want to live. And because from my perspective, that's not really what God's saying. Again, like he's not saying this is how we live right now. He's saying in this ancient culture, this is how you create a trajectory of more dignity for all people, so that all can come and worship before the Lord, and everybody can be clean before Him, essentially. So Lord, we thank you for your Torah. We thank you for your word. We thank you for your heart for all people, Lord. We ask that you would just continue to help us wrestle through the difficult issues, Lord. We thank you for Yeshua. We thank you for the one who knew no sin coming and dying and being raised, Lord. And we do eagerly await your return, Lord, when you will bring justice to the earth in a greater measure, Lord. And Lord, we just ask that your presence would be with us in service and through the rest of this Shabbat, Lord. We just ask that that we would have a greater revelation of you and who you are in your heart towards us, Lord. Be with all who are serving and ministering today, Lord, and we just ask that you would help us all to steward your presence well, Lord. B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.